Before we begin, this is a podcast about terrorism, which does mean that we do talk about acts of terrorism and extreme violence, so you may find some of the following material upsetting. Hello, I'm Fatma Ahmed, your host and guide in this series of Taking Apart Terror, the West Africa edition. Together, we'll analyze the realities of violent extremism in West Africa and delve into the local, regional, and international effort and initiatives to prevent and counter violent extremism. In today's episode, we'll be asking, is there a way out? Joining me as we unpack this question are Luc Chounet-Cambas, Peace and Stability expert, and Florian Morier, Stabilization Advisor at UNDP. So let's get started. In this episode, we're really trying to unpack and understand some of the reasons for defection, the various different pathways to defect, specifically in the different regional contexts in the Sahel, West Africa, and understanding the different roles communities play and government play. So to start us off in a conversation, Luc, it'd be great to hear from your years of experience and reflections, what are some of the reasons for defection and disengagement from ISWAP?
Okay, thanks for the question, Fatma. I guess in my view, it's got to do with two elements mostly. One is disenchantment. Quite often in the case of people I met in Chad, and I ended up meeting with about 600 to 700 people who had either voluntarily joined Boko Haram or been forcibly taken to Boko Haram. There were large cases of people who were disenchanted. They had left for the wrong reasons, and they had left in pursuit of what they thought would be a better life. And I still remember one of them telling me that, he had been promised, quote unquote, iced water and food galore. And then came to realize when he was in boot camp in northern Nigeria that it was anything but. So a lot of disenchantment and a lot of fear. Living conditions were harsh back home, were definitely harsher under Boko Haram rule, and people would live in fear of, atrocities and things acts of violence that commit upon others, and fear of violence that would be inflicted upon them if they were not to comply. So as far as I'm concerned, these were the two main drivers of defection or disengagement. To some extent, a lot of the people will stay in touch with friends and families back home. So to the extent that there would be movements back to a given country, kind of like amicable social pressure would help, but it was not, at least for people I met with at the time, a major factor of defection.
Interesting. And Florian, has that been also your similar experiences from, engaging with those that have left some of these groups and as well?
Yeah, with those I talked with in Niger, yes, as Luc said, it was mainly disenchantment. They promised to receive some amount of money, and when they start to be engaged, the money has been taken away. And then they really thought to be involved to promote religious ideas. But when they were engaged in the group, they realized it was much more really conflict activities. And I also think why they also decide to quit is of course because of the deployment of the many security actors. So the war is not easy. And then I also think that persons, most of the time they start a family life. And then when they start it, I think they start to take care a little bit of their children. That's why so many surrenders, they came with their own family. They built this family in the bush. Of course, others came without family, but I suspect for some of them, also the family parts could be important or should take into account.
But of course, in the context of the Niger-Chad Basin, various different countries, different contexts, are the pathways out of ISWAP the same in these countries, or are they different? How do they manage to get out?
How the condition to quit? It's absolutely not an easy path. People I talk with, first of all, they are carrying a lot of intel. And if they quit the group, they are potentially put the group at risk. So it's really hard for them to quit the group because the group doesn't want them to quit. And most of them have been forced to join. So quit the group, it's especially to quit with a family, it's a strategy. And then you have to cross different territory, which is in control by the army, and they don't know how they will be received. But it really depends on different countries. And sometimes the country communicates about their program. Other countries are absolutely not prepared for. Some countries also have different messages. But the issue is also depending to who they are going to disengage or to be in a village, the future can be very different. So it's not easy.
In Chad, it was an interesting case that at least, when the first wave of defections took place in, starting in late 2016, you had hundreds and at one point, 1,600 people who were deemed to be affiliated with Boko Haram who had returned to Chad. And the reason they'd been able to return was because the return was, unhindered. They would be systematically debriefed by the state's, intelligence and security services, but essentially, except for a few people being arrested here and there, most of them were were let free and were able to go back to a different community or go back to a situation of displacement within the Chad border. So that was a strong incentive for return because they basically realized fairly rapidly that return was free and they would not be subject to violence, coercion, systematic arrest, so on and so forth. But that was the case in Chad where there was also an extremely strong network of surveillance at community level. So the security services were confident enough in their ability to prevent, issues, at least be informed of what the situation would be. When it comes to Nigeria, the people I spoke to at the time, including Nigerian officials, the situation was a bit different because there was a scheme of pathway of Boko Haram going through transit camp and the Gombe facility. And basically, Operation Corridor gave them an opportunity to surrender and go through what was deemed the rehabilitation process. So these were the two main pathways by Boko Haram at the time for these two countries.
Luke, just to expand on that, because it's very interesting, getting different examples in terms of, some having a very formal process of screening and, being in these centers and the others being able to return to the community. What does the screening process look like? Is it the same in each country or for instance, in Nigeria and Chad, as you speak to? And that there's different experiences as well. And of course, you've been involved in this in so many different capacities. What have your experience been the same? What have you observed in the different pathways, how people have left as well? It would be actually great to hear because you both have spoken about the screening processes and how different countries in context, whether people are aware of the program specifically in Nigeria or Operation Safe Corridor has often been referenced. But yeah, it'd be really interesting to hear a bit more from your experience and those you have spoken to. What is the experience like within the rehabilitation process itself, the type of support that they are provided?
The experience of return was a mixture of being back home and being alive. Of fear, I think the point that Florian made is really important for the few youngsters I met who had joined the Islamic State of appeal of the jihadi ideology. They returned and we were having a conversation nearby the Nigerian border. And when I asked them, if they had any fear for their own security, they told me, of course I do, because, if Boko Haram knows I'm here, they'll kill me before they kill you. You may well be a foreigner, but I'm a trader. So for a number of them, it's they do live in fear. It's not an easy process. They have been disconnected for years from their family. And sometimes, the whole process basically has been facilitated by intra-family disputes and treasons. I remember cases of at least one woman who was telling me that it's her own little brother one basically forced her to join Boko Haram. So when she actually came back without her brother, the community was angry at her for denouncing or being, in their own words, disrespectful of her brother. That's first. And then she was also rejected by her husband because at the time she'd been taken to Boko Haram, she was bearing child because she was forced marched from hundreds of kilometers. She lost the child. She had a miscarriage. And when they came back, the husband basically was asking for reparation for losing what he did was his child. So there was a lot of rejection. And for a number of women, I remember being taken aback by how much stigma comes with being single and having no children. In both cases, a lot of the female participants or returnees were really ostracized or rejected by a community which, seen them as a bit of a burden, a bit of a letdown. So it's not easy. The real dilemma as the Nigerian authorities struggle with is that they have people in transit facilities that couldn't release them because the communities didn't want them back. They threatened to actually kill them. So they couldn't do anything with that. And they aren't forced in that scenario and they got stuck and stranded in the process. So yeah, at least I can speak of these two scenarios. Florian, what do you think?
The question was on rehabilitation. I am always doing the difference between rehabilitation and reintegration. To me, rehabilitation is what's happening when the person is still in a camp, supervised or managed and not able to move freely. And then he received a package of training and support in what we call de-radicalization. This is what I'm thinking when we talked about rehabilitation. But before rehabilitation starts, it needs, as you said, just a program to be in place, because if not, on which basis we will start a rehabilitation program? Most of the donors are really interested and start program and start funding on the rehabilitations. But if the basis is not there, and this was my job about, by the way, it's to put in place the national strategy, the legal framework before to make the rehabilitation possible. So voila, for the rehabilitation part, I mean, this de-radicalization program in a camp, it's just a piece of the whole reintegration path, and it's not an easy one as well. It's also required many prerequisites before to be implemented.
No, and thank you, Florian. I want to come back to a point, Luc, you mentioned about, this rejection in some communities and that their lives are also at threat. Is there a role that communities can play, whether it's community leaders, to be able to support this reintegration process?
Okay, in theory and in practice, the answer is yes. Because as you can imagine, at least in some parts of the lecture where you understand is essentially absent, a lot of the social interactions are regulated at the community or the tribal level. So the community has a very important role to indeed accept people back, or at least not make them feel ostracized. So in theory and in practice, yes. Where I see a bit of a caveat, though, is expecting the community to play a role in accepting people back in the absence of dedicated resources to do so is always something I struggle a bit with. I've worked on a number of social cohesion initiatives where, you expect that, traditional elders will do this, will do that. And, there's going to be funding in facilitating dialogue sessions and things like that. But people have real pragmatic needs when it comes to housing, when it comes to access to basic services, when it comes to making ends meet and basic livelihoods. So I think yes, communities and tribes in this case have a fundamental role to play, but we collectively as international agents of change are key enablers in making sure that we put our money where our mouth is and we enable people to do the best possible job and have resources to actually make it happen. And because I think that again, the conditions were so spartan and so difficult that, there's only so much expectation you're going to have from the community to share, resources that most of them don't necessarily have in the first place.
Florian, I'm sure you've had some experience on this as well.
What I also experienced is, of course, the big issue of reintegrate people associated with the armed group into a community. They are immediately targeted, marginalized. And some points, because the whole process I've seen, for instance, in Niger, was really related to the justice sector, actually. When the disengage came, the negotiation was about all the information they shared with the justice. Thanks to this information, they were able to make some progress and to move on about the captured person and not the disengaged people, because even the captured, they need to build the file and move on with this on these cases. So at some points, I try to experiment the idea with the attorney, the idea of protection of witness program, because if that persons, they really collaborate with the justice, they share very valuable intel. This intel was on the basis of the trials. It was not fair to reintegrate that people into communities where they I've seen to have collaborative people with the justice and be immediately at risk, especially in places where the conflict is still ongoing. So we explore the idea of protection of witness to be reintegrated in different localities.
You look at these environments where we work, in the case of like more Lake Chad, where there is an expectation of a process of screening and risk assessment, and you realize a number of things. There is, to this day, I was working on this for the past 4 months in another country. There is no international precedent of any kind of screening and risk assessment process for a caseload of a few thousand people. It just doesn't exist. That's first. There's no international precedent for such a process to be administered to women, let alone children. So we basically are trying to put in place systems that have never been tested before, at least not to that kind of scale and level of magnitude. And in countries where the capabilities are much lower, the environment doesn't have the same extent of resources, and you want to repatriate them in an environment where there's already a lot of social tensions, if not conflict, and a lot of competition for resources that are not sufficient in the first place. In order to be appropriate, the approach requires a level of agility that is sometimes difficult to find.
But unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Thank you for listening in to this episode. In the next episode, we'll be asking the question, what is the bigger picture? Please follow or subscribe so you don't miss an episode. I'm Fatma Ahmed. Until next time, goodbye.